The Great War had scattered people around when usually they'd gone no farther than a dozen miles from their own village. And when strangers came along, they usually brought disease with them, so strangers were feared and hated. Jews traveled more easily from foreign lands because of their common language, and in most other countries, Jews were ostracized, but in German cities they'd been welcomed. Many Jews had been traveling salesmen after being chased out during pogroms and other witch hunts, and for centuries their principal product had been opium brought up from the Golden Crescent in the Holy Land. If pain was the disease and opium was the cure, and no medical treatment alleviated suffering as well as opium, and no medicine alleviated opium dependence except more opium, the Jewish peddlers who brought this miraculous relief to isolated German villages had become both a blessing and a curse. The witch-burning had not been done by a mob of maddened peasants, but by the educated magistrate, and the university in Vienna would not admit their first Jew until 1787, and no Jew was admitted into Parliament in England until 1855. In Austria, Jews had been banned from being lawyers or doctors until 1862. And because Jews were not allowed into schools, they created their own Hebrew schools, and that made it easier to flee from persecution because, at least where they went, they were able to speak the same language with their new countrymen. Jews were thought to be overly ambitious to make up for past persecutions, and Jews were not welcome in the country, so they lived in the cities. And after the Great War, Berlin in the 20s and early 30s was even worse than the scenes in the movie Cabaret. So Jews were accused of bringing immorality into Germany, and stories about the destructive and depraved Jews terrified the German peasants. The lives of the common country folk hadn't changed for centuries, and superstition was rampant with their tales of haunted forests and witches' spells, and disease was still thought to be caused by demon possession, so many villages still burned at least one witch every year just to be safe. Most German villages were sleepy and backward, so when a stranger came through, they definitely stood out, and the only Jews these people had ever known were the traveling peddlers bringing opium that allowed their women to bear children without pain, and to the deeply religious, this was seen as going against God's will. German country folk did not want government intruding on their lives and rarely took advantage of the social welfare programs started by the Kaiser that were used primarily by people in the cities. The sick and the old could always find something useful to do on the farm, or at least be out of the way. So unemployment was not a problem in German farming villages, and few of them even noticed the Nazi storm blowing through Germany. Jew bashing was nothing new, a leftover from centuries of religious warfare, and there had been armies marching through their villages longer than that, first one side devastating the countryside, and then the other marching through, leaving death and destruction in their wake, and Hitler's war was just one more wave of the same. The villagers would gather in the local tavern to drink beer and sing songs, and for the most part, they ignored Hitler and his speeches, and these German country people saw the Nazis as just more city folk making trouble. When people from the city began paying higher prices for the food grown in the village, the country folk in Germany started to notice, and more city people were coming out to the farms wanting to buy until the villagers started running low themselves, and the villagers grew the same amount of corn and beets and rutabagas and cabbages, and fed the same amount of pigs every year. So the disruption caused by the Nazis' socialism had gotten their attention. The villagers' livestock were more like family than animals, and the country Germans would go out to the fields every day to cut fresh grass for their animals, bringing the pasture to the cow, and this way the animals would not trample the precious grass with grazing. The horses and cows were kept in the living room during the winter, or in a room adjoining the living quarters, and this helped to heat the house. And they were more than dismayed when the Nazis would come after their livestock in pursuit of Hitler's war. New farming machines mass-producing food had lowered the prices for their city-bound products before the war. And German farmers had blamed the city folk for being unwilling to pay the actual cost. And Hitler had seen that as a failure of morality, so he had no sympathy when it came time for requisitioning their horses and livestock. At least Hitler could count on the country folk not to shelter Jews, and as hard as the war would be on Jews, it was worse for the horses. Hitler blamed Judeo-Christianity for bringing down the Roman Empire, and in the 30s everyone wanted to be Roman, with Mussolini the foremost virile example, and Rome was a close second. Before Jews had spread their version of spirituality into the Nordic realms, the German forest peoples had a pre-Christian religion all their own, and the ancient Germans thought illegitimate children were just as worthy as those born within marriage, which explained why it was considered normal for Hitler's mother to have been born illegitimate, since 1/3 of German children were. The leader of the SA was flamboyantly gay, and thus a real man's man. And Ernst Julius Gunther Röhm had serious scars on his face from being wounded in the Great War. Speaking his name sounded like the revving of a motorcycle engine, and right after the Great War, Röhm founded the Storm Battalion and started the Reichskriegflagge, or the Imperial Flag Club, that carried guns as well as flags, and they joined the Imperial Flag Combat League, and these both joined the stormtroopers who had fought in the Great War. The early SA had a lot to do with galloping horses in martial maneuvers with flags flying, and it was more than an impressive spectacle because they were deadly serious about avenging the fatherland over the politicians who had stabbed Germany in the back. Röhm wasn't particularly interested in politics, but just wanted to have a little army of his own, and Röhm had been the best fundraiser for the Nazis and had always been able to come up with rich male friends willing to donate, and he was also a master at procuring weapons. Röhm turned the stormtroopers into his own private club, and when Hitler challenged him, Röhm sent a resignation letter to all the newspapers asking Hitler, quote, not to deprive him of his personal friendship, close quote, that had clear romantic undertones, so Hitler gave him an unmistakable answer on the 30th of June in 1934 that would be called the Night of Long Knives, and it was a warning to the entire German nation that, quote, homosexuality, debauchery, drunkenness, and high living, close quote, would no longer be tolerated in Germany's government. The message was received loud and clear, and few protested the Night of Long Knives because being gay was something known to be encouraged by Jews, and a large part of the accusation against Jews was that they wanted to turn everyone into sexual degenerates. Henry Ford had a factory in Germany and wanted to enlighten the world with his Dearborn Independent newspaper, and Ford said Jews had started the Great War, Bolshevism, Darwinism, Marxism, Nietzsche, short skirts, and lipstick. They were behind Wall Street and the international bankers and the white slave traffic and the movies and the Supreme Court and ragtime and the illegal liquor business. The Big Money by John Dos Passos, New York, Washington Square Press, Inc., Houghton Mifflin Company, 1930, 1961, page 55, part of the U.S. trilogy, which includes the 42nd parallel and 1919. At first, each Jewish family was required to send one person to the camps to help in the rebuilding of Germany, and the family was told that their wages would be sent back home, but the money usually did not arrive because the Germans running the camps were confiscating it simply because it was so easy. Instead, another notice would be sent requesting an additional family member until in a few years the entire family had to report for work duty. Trains going through Switzerland had locked cars with bars on the windows, and people could be heard inside crying for water when they stopped at a station, and the good Swiss citizens would keep their distance and point at the cars, saying, "There go more criminals." Passenger trains would pull a few extra cars attached to the rear with signs that said, "Danger, criminals," and the regular passengers were proud that modern government was able to so efficiently deal with these lawbreakers so honest citizens could be kept safe. As the concentration camps filled up, townspeople would point to them with pride, happy that the government was finally doing something about crime and corruption, and the Nazis kept meticulous records, not simply because they thought what they were doing was correct and proper, but because they thought they were being scientific, and keeping accurate records would help with the overall effort. A place was needed to put all the people under arrest for sabotaging National Socialism, separate from the work camps, and the first jails were just warehouses and then barracks belonging to the army. And for inmates unable to pay their fines, groups of them were made to build more barracks and put up barbed wire fences around them. All over Germany, hundreds of compounds were built for the Nazis, and with a simple phone call, a carload of men with guns would come and take away your neighbors, and the gunmen were acting as officers of the court. As the camps filled up, it became a matter of choosing who would or who would not be capable of performing productive labor that could benefit the fatherland, and being sent to the camps was not a death sentence at first, but an opportunity to work for the government. The camps and work distribution centers were everywhere, and all the Germans trusted the government to behave in everyone's best interests, and being sentenced to the camps was a chance to work, if money problems had been the only reason you'd been arrested. The concentration camps were built like military boot camps to teach the value of hard work, and there were 165 labor camps and 22 prison camps in Germany by 1938, a country slightly bigger than the states of Washington and Oregon combined. And including Poland, there were over 300 concentration camps, while the processing centers were merely transfer stations or hubs, or temporary holding areas. Most thought the camps were a good idea, except for a few businessmen who worried about competing in the market with the forced labor. But the economy was under such stress after the cost of the Great War that the harm was overlooked, and most of the work being done by the camp prisoners was in preparation for the defense of Germany when the international bankers were expected to soon bring war against the fatherland. German businessmen accommodated the competition to their own industries, and the camp system actually became a new form of government, with the idea that having a camp in every neighborhood provided a convenient place where the law would preside, and if you had a problem with your neighbor, you could have him sent to the camp to be heard by the court, which was easier and cheaper than dealing with lawyers, or you could just threaten him with it, and this form of government was useful in collecting fines for the state and in settling old grudges. Up until 1936, there'd been only 10 camps with 10,000 prisoners each, but that year the economy had shifted towards war production, and more incarcerated workers were needed to meet the labor demand, and in the next 3 years they built 10 times as many camps and even more processing centers for the political prisoners awaiting trial, and the best Jewish tailors were put to work in them, making great uniforms for the German army. People were arrested and sent to processing centers for not wanting to work where the government sent them, or for complaining about the low wages, or for changing jobs to get a better work environment or to get a higher wage. And those with access to money could buy their way out of the camps, either by bribing the officials or by paying fines to the court. But most Jewish bank accounts were seized when they were arrested, and so being released became increasingly difficult as they were unable to pay. The Germans basically set out to prove that Jews were incapable of work, and for the first 3 years the Nazi government was making payroll off the bank accounts and home sales of the 10,000 people wearing striped clothing in prison camps. But when they'd used up all the assets from this first batch, the Nazis needed to find another source of funds to keep the government going, because the German payroll was monstrously large. The Strength Through Joy programs cost plenty of money, and Strength Through Joy was not just field trips, but also adult education classes and cruises on ocean liners. The bank accounts and property seized from Jews fueled Hitler's economic miracle. But when the available assets began to dwindle, Hitler needed to annex Austria and Czechoslovakia, and when those too were drained of Jewish money, he had to go into Poland. But the amount of money seized from Polish Jews turned out to be less than what was needed, despite the myth of the money-hoarding Jew, and the military was consuming much more of the budget than the Jews could cough up. By that time, systemic corruption had set in and was bleeding needed funds away from the Reich treasury into private pockets, as the camps turned out to be a great money-maker for the people running them. Although intended as work centers, the managers quickly realized that more money could be made in direct confiscation of assets than by forced labor, and when asked how things were going, the managers would report that the prisoners were dying of disease and more workers were needed to take their place. So in the first 3 years after Hitler's election, 10 times as many camps needed to be built, and 100 times more people were put into them after giving up their bank account numbers and signing over the title deeds to their homes, told that their signatures were for safekeeping with the local bank. Hunting down Jews became the business of Germany, and the government payroll came from police searches and seizures, and people disappeared and didn't come back, and suddenly there would be nice new people moving into their old houses, while the new owners gave away the previous owners' furniture and clothes and kitchenware, and people soon forgot about the old owners and did not want to have to give back any of the goods should they someday return. The Germans imagined that the previous owners had done something terrible to have had their homes confiscated, and there were too few attempts to find anyone innocent in the camps because the seized bank accounts and assets would have had to be returned. Because there was a camp in every town and a processing center in every neighborhood, everybody knew how they worked, and what made the camps function so well was that most of the people in them were innocent, and everyone knew it. And everyone knew it was not necessary to commit a crime to get sent away, so people redoubled their efforts to get along with the state. By 1937, only 1/3 the number of people were in the camps as had been in them in 1933, because people had learned how to behave so as not to be sent away. Sabotage in the work camps was rare, as saboteurs were strictly policed by the other campers, many of whom were real cutthroat criminals, and the camps were seen as an efficient way to deal with offenders where they would be given some real justice. Actual Nazis who ended up imprisoned remained loyal to Hitler, believing their own incarceration to be just a mistake. Jews in Germany were more mainstream than anywhere else in the world, and had become indistinguishable to the point where they had to volunteer their Jewishness. The conversation with a neighbor would go something like, "Oh, isn't Hitler wonderful? He's saving us from Jews. But Jews are good people. I'm half Jewish myself." The next week, in the middle of the night, a gang of Nazis would break into that neighbor's home and send the family away on a truck, and the state would profit from the sale of the house, and the new neighbors would remark about how great it was to live in Germany, where humble people like themselves could afford to buy such a fine place to live.